Since the 1480s, Europeans have been coming to the North Atlantic shores of the western portion, which is now called America. These were the Basques, the French, and the English who were fishing for cod off New England. Cod had become a major profit-making element because of the Catholic edict to prevent eating meat on Fridays, and cities like Spain, Madrid and Paris, had no ready access for the number of fish they needed, and salt cod could be caught in the Western Atlantic and then shipped back to the Eastern Atlantic and sold at high profit and still be good to eat in the various cities weeks later. At the time the Europeans first came, they didn't interact with the first peoples of this continent. They basically would leave things on the shore that they didn't need to take back with them, and the natives would pick those up, but there wasn't a whole lot of attempt to interact. That came much later. When it did come, the first people to come over there were explorers and mostly Catholic priests, the Jesuits, who came with the French and started educating the natives to the European way of life. Unfortunately, they never tried to learn the actual life of the people who were here before the Europeans came. Because we didn't grow, or we didn't have animals, we did not have deer in a pen, we did not have turkeys in a cage, we went out and hunted, they automatically assumed we were hunter-gatherers, which is rather fascinating, considering we gave them crops of corn, we gave them beans, squash, tomatoes, peppers, red peppers. These are all things that were first grown here, and potatoes. There were over 3,000 varieties of potatoes grown in the New World before the Europeans came across. So we weren't really hunter-gatherers. We had villages, and those villages had crops attached to them. This is very important because the Europeans still felt a need to consider us to be some kind of savage, less than human. And everybody for centuries has ignored that paradox. We were growing plants, we were having villages, we had many of the same things they had in Europe, and yet we were savages, and nobody's understood that. I believe I've broken the reason for that. When the Europeans first came, the societies of the first people were clan villages. We were not tribes. A tribe assumes large areas all encompassed by one governing entity, and our governing entity was, with few exceptions, purely a village entity. The clans each had council members that were on the village council. The council elected a white sachem, who was the person who decided the agenda of the council, and a red sachem, who was basically the one that enforced whatever the council decided. So our society was a small village-based society. Now, what we did have that the Europeans never understood was a communication potential, not just with other people in the same language group, but with people all over the northern continent. And we actually had a language that was universal that nobody's paid a lot of attention to. The language is the language of signs. Greetings. This was the meaning of the people greeting each other, to say, I'm a friend, or at least I'm not a hazard. Open hands are usually an indication you're not carrying a weapon in them. This was something universally known throughout the continent. What though? Thank you was two hands coming down. This was universally recognized. They had an entire language that people could go from the extreme northeast to the far west and communicate with most of the people in there that were also clan villages. We did have the people who were still hunter-gatherers in certain areas, but the basic city, the basic community. So There were hunter-gatherers, but they lived in areas that were far out and they didn't have the ability to do planting. Now, one of these areas that couldn't do planting was the Great Plains. When you have millions of bisons roaming over the plains, if you planted a crop, not only would the crops be gone after a year or so, but so would you, because that many bison, buffalo, you can't run away from. The other thing that they didn't understand was the clan society within the village. Each village had anywhere from 5 to 9 clans, and each clan had their own political setup. Their political setup consisted of the cherished grandmothers who were elected by the men of the village or the clan and the women of the clan. So each time somebody thought that the cherished grandmothers weren't really representing the clan appropriately, the men and women could get together, decide to take them out, and insert a new set of cherished grandmothers. So we had a very democratic format for selecting people within the clan and within the village. The other element is we had clans that were sister clans. So as an ancient Bear Clan member, my sister clan would be the Deer Clan, the Sweet Potato Clan, the Red Paint Clan. So all these people would consider me a cousin, not just within my own village, but within any village I visited. So I would wear something that indicated I was a member of the Bear Clan. They'd recognize that, and as such, when I came into the village, I would acknowledge, I'd move in with the Bear Clan people, and they would feed me. I would work with them, hunt with them. I would provide my effort in return for their services, and we would all get along as if I was a cousin that came to visit. But I could do that throughout the entire eastern United States, from the mountains on the west side, the Ozark Mountains on the west side of the Mississippi, all the way to New England. This gave us a way to communicate with other villages and with other people, as a matter of fact, but it wasn't like we were governing it. It's not like I would go to another village and be part of their decision making. I would listen to it. They might even ask me questions, but in the end, there was no universal government that would take me from one place to the other. The one exception to that was the people called the Haudenosaunee. The Europeans called them the Iroquois. The Haudenosaunee had a great law of peace. It was recited every year at the council, and it brought together 5 different peoples. The Mohawks were on the eastern side, the Seneca were on the western side, the Onondaga were in the middle, and they were the keeper of the fires, and with 2 others, the Cayuga and the Oneida, these 5 formed a chain of a covenant of agreement, and they all agreed with the Great Law of Peace. So anybody interested in finding out more about that can go onto the internet and just call up the Great Law of Peace. That allowed council members to be assigned not by the villages of each of the areas, but by the clans. So the clans of the Mohawks would be represented on the council. The clans of the Seneca, the clans of the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, these were all represented, but it's as clans, because the clans related to each other. And so they'd get together at the council meetings in the Onondaga area. There was a place that they still meet, as a matter of fact. And they would make decisions that related to maintaining the peace, not just among the chain of the Haudenosaunee, but also maintaining peace with outsiders who might think they had an opportunity to come in and conquer or take over some land, which they'd figure out very quickly they couldn't do, because the council could draw warriors from all 5 of the villages, all 5 of the areas. And this is the hard part to remember. The Mohawks were a language group. The Seneca were a language group, and their villages were all related and could easily talk to each other. They all spoke a common language, but these were not really tribes. Once again, they were all clan villages. They just associated because most of them were related to the villages around them, not by marriage, because there was no marriage, but by the fact that many of the children were children of more than one village. And this was important. Although the great covenant, the Great Law of Peace, was only in the Haudenosaunee, many of the other peoples knew about it and followed similar governance in ways of treating among themselves past the local villages. The Wasatch, who were the river people, who were west of the Mississippi and south of the Missouri and north of the Arkansas, they understood a lot of the processes of the Haudenosaunee. The Anye people, who were in the Green Mountain or the mountains of Tennessee and Georgia, these people also were and had spent time with the people in the Haudenosaunee and understood how they work. So, and they were all close enough to where they could visit each other on a regular basis. And once again, their visits were based on clan relationships, not tribes, not language, but actually just a villager traveling and meeting other people based on their clan relationships. This brings us up to the clan setup. The clans in the first people's villages were all matrilineal. I talked about the cherished grandmother. That means the women were considered the holder of the clan. Now the clan had property within the village, which was one piece of property was where they lived, and they built their homes there, where they were huts or longhouses, depending on where you were at. They also had land that they had for growing their crops, their three sisters' crops, the corn or maize, the beans, and the squash, which were grown together. And each clan had a certain amount of farmland they needed to feed the people in the clan. Each clan typically had between 30 and 70 people in it. Each village typically had at the most 300 adult people within the village. More than that, and you start getting into a place that it no longer works. So they started dividing off and finding a new village for those people based on sending clans out and opening up a whole new area that hadn't been before. But the clans also had a common hunting ground. Now the hunting ground was common, but the clans went out there and they'd actually figure out, they'd know every deer within their hunting ground. They'd know every turkey within their hunting ground. And they actually had people in the hunting ground 24/7 that would keep the turkey and the deer within a certain area so that they could hunt them. They would never kill the main buck. They would never kill the does. They would never kill the fawns. What they would kill for food would be the young bucks, who never would have a chance to have their own family group, because one bull would actually produce all the offsprings for a certain amount of deer. Now, on the turkey, it wasn't so much, you just knew which ones were. And they could identify each deer individually. They could identify the turkeys. And in the clan council, or in the village councils, every year they would decide which of the new deer belonged to which of the clans, and they'd all come to an agreement on it. One of the interesting things about the village clan, or the village council, is all decisions had to be unanimous. Everybody had to agree before something was settled. So they literally agree on which, and then each clan could decide which deer they would harvest, which turkey they would harvest at a particular time. If there were elk or moose or something else within their hunting grounds, those would also be considered that way. Now let's say a bear came into their hunting ground and killed a deer. If the bear came into the hunting ground and they could do it, they would run them off before they'd have a chance to kill a deer. But if it did kill the deer, the clans or the village would actually send warriors out who would ultimately hunt and kill the bear, and then the people who hunted the bear would get the teeth, the claws, the skin, but all the meat would go to the clans, or whatever clan or clans had lost deer, to the bear. Same thing with if you had a pack of wolves and they killed a number of deer. They'd kill the wolves, and then they would distribute the meat to the people who had lost deer because of the wolves hunting their deer. They also hunted geese, and they hunted ducks, and they fished, and they had they set traps for the smaller animals. But these were their primary animals, with one exception that we all know about, which was the bison. And all the way up through New England, bison were actually attracted. They were run up there to keep bison available for the various peoples that lived along the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, all the way down to the Arkansas, and to the other rivers that went to the east, that were part of this. Now, that explains a little bit about the village and the matrilineal society, but the question became, if the village or if the clans were matrilineal, if they were based on the mothers, how did they have children? The Europeans would go into a village and they'd say to a man, they'd never talk to women because to the Europeans, women were property. So they would never interact with a woman unless they were forced to, and even then they did it with the kind of disdain that you would expect a person who thought of a woman as property would give to a woman who acted like they owned property. So they would go up to a man and they'd say, well, which are your offspring? Which is your son? Which is your oldest son? And the man would look at them and say, I don't understand. And they say, well, what woman mothered your child? And they'd say, we don't know what you're talking about. The reason they didn't know what they were talking about, since the clan was matrilineal, it was made up of the men who were the brothers and the sons and the uncles of the women, not the fathers. The fathers were basically sperm donors. The clan women would decide, they see somebody that they thought of, let's say they needed a good hunter for their clan. They would find the best hunter in their village that wasn't part of their clan, and they would send some of their young women to have sex with him so they could have a child that hopefully would be as good a hunter as the father. But the father never even knew whether he was having a child with him or not, because to the father, sex was entertainment. It was only the women that considered sex as propagation, and it was always for the betterment of the clan. The way you can find that out to justify what I'm saying, read the Corps of Discovery diaries of Lewis and Clark's explorations from what was a small French village of St. Louis to the Pacific and back, and you'll find Clark brought along his slave, whose name was Yark. And Yark is described as a big, powerful black man. And all the diaries that you can read talk about how when they would camp with the natives, with the first peoples in the villages, and they, oddly enough, were able to make it all the way across and back without ever fighting any of the first peoples. The first peoples, they'd say the husbands would bring the wives to sleep with Yark. Now, even in a non-European society, a husband and wife team would have no reason to introduce the wife to another man for sex. That was the brothers and the uncles that were bringing the sisters and the nieces to visit Yark to make sure that nobody else decided to take advantage of the situation. And that way they brought back their sisters, daughters, aunts to the clan with the seed of the child they wanted. That's how I figured out that all this idea of how if you go to the National Museum in Washington, D.C., it actually talks about how in a clan society, the man would move into the woman's clan, which was ludicrous, because if you had that, a third of your clan would not be from your clan. They would be honoring another clan. That doesn't work in any way. The only way it could work is if the father wasn't related. And if you go to New England and you visit some of the museums there, you'll read, and even I think in Washington, D.C., you'll read about how it was the uncles that taught the children. Never mentioned the fathers being the teachers. It was always the uncles. And that was how the clan worked. Now, that also meant the people who slept together were the clan members. And when the Jesuits came in and found out that the sisters were sleeping with the brothers and the uncles, they went mad. This is just unbelievable. This is savage. The children are all bastards at best. So they basically considered that native process as being an abomination to God. And remember, in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, there were people being killed in Europe because they didn't agree with the tenets of God. And even though they were actually killing a lot of the people here, but one of the justifications they had for doing that was that these were still savages, and the reason they were savages is because the women and men slept together. Now, they never bothered to find out that even though they were sleeping in the same buildings, the same longhouse or the same hut, they weren't having sex. Sex was something you did in the daytime outside of the village or on the fringes of the village, not something you do when you're sleeping with 10 or 70 of your relatives. So this created a problem that lasted until the 1960s. And why the 1960s? Because unfortunately, the clan society was totally eradicated by the 1960s. And the way this happened was, as they pushed the first persons further and further west, those first persons that assimilated, which simply meant they got married. Those that got married were accepted as assimilated into the white society. Those that clung to the clan society, those who did not get married and had bastard children, these were still savages. And they were treated that way all the way up until the 20th century. Now, once they finally got the first peoples onto reservations, the reservations were taken over. They called them the factors, the people who distributed the government funds to them. The factors were almost always one of the churches, not always the Catholics, but always one of the churches. They went out there as missionaries, they treated with, and their whole purpose was to assimilate the first peoples. And how did they assimilate the first people? They got them to have women and men get married and have children and come to church. And these were good assimilated first people. If the people resisted, and if the people stayed away from the church and they maintained their clan society, then they saw this as women unmarried having children. Now, what do you do in the European society if a woman who's not married has a child? You condemn them as being unfit to be a mother, and you take the child away. And literally, up until the 1960s, people from the Bureau of Indian Affairs would go onto the reservations, they'd talk to the factors, the priests, and the priests would tell them which were not assimilated, which were not good Christians, and they'd go out there and find these fatherless children, and they would take them away and put them in orphanages, usually in the far north, hundreds of miles, maybe 1,000 miles away from where their families were, where their clan was. Now, needless to say, between the 1890s, when this actually started, in 1960, in that time, ultimately, they wiped out the clan society. Any first people that did not accept the concept of marriage and children within the marriage and being a member of the church, they were still savages. They were not assimilated, and those were the ones they took the children away. You take the children away long enough, and there's going to be no next generation. And by 1960, there was no clan societies left to take the children away from. And that's why we're finding all these old missionary schools that took the Native American children in, and they're finding graves there. Why are they finding graves on the site of young children? Because these were children that once again fought the concept of becoming Christian, fought the concept of not having a clan society, and ultimately became so uncontrollable to the priests and the missionaries that were running these schools that they were more likely beaten to death, starved to death. And it may not have been deliberate, it may have been deliberate, but whatever happened, we've got the grave sites to prove a lot of them didn't make it to adulthood. And this, my friends, is what the present first people don't acknowledge even themselves, because all the first people today who live on reservations, who are tribal, were assimilated. And they wouldn't be here today if they weren't. And I have to watch out, because they could hate me greatly for mentioning what I've told you today. I wish you all the luck in the world, and I hope to provide some more information on how we lived as the first people prior to the European involvement. Wato, thank you.